There are moments in life when everything appears ordinary. A quiet apartment, a young mother learning how to raise a newborn, a routine day that begins like any other. But sometimes, beneath the surface of normal life, there are signals that something is deeply wrong. Signals that can be overlooked. Signals that can be dismissed. Signals that, tragically, come into focus only when it is too late. In the spring of 2025, emergency responders were called to a home in Susquehanna Township. Inside that apartment was a 4-month-old baby named Ioni Souders. Her life had barely begun, and yet within hours, a routine emergency call would evolve into a criminal investigation that raised painful questions about trust, responsibility, and the unseen dangers that can exist behind closed doors. Tonight, we examine the events that led to that moment and the lessons that remain long after the headlines fade. Before becoming the subject of a tragic case, Ioni Souders was simply a baby beginning her life. Born in late 2024, she arrived in a world that should have been filled with warmth, protection, and possibility. For infants, every day is a milestone. A new sound, a new facial expression, the discovery of light, movement, and voices. The people around them become their entire universe. At the center of Ioni's world was her mother, Ioni Souders. At just 20 years old, Layla was navigating the overwhelming responsibilities of young adulthood while also raising a newborn. Parenthood can be challenging at any age. For someone barely out of their teenage years, those challenges can feel even heavier. Young parents often face financial pressure, emotional stress, and the difficult process of learning how to care for another life while still figuring out their own. During this time, Layla had begun a relationship with Jose Melendez Padilla. Relationships can offer support or introduce instability, and in this story, the presence of a new partner would later become a central focus of the investigation. To outsiders, the household may have appeared ordinary, but investigators would later question whether warning signs had been building long before authorities ever became involved. To understand what happened, investigators reconstructed the days and weeks leading up to the emergency call. Like many cases involving young children, the timeline depended largely on the statements of the adults responsible for the child's care. During the early months of Ioni's life, family members and acquaintances occasionally visited the apartment. Infants require constant attention, feeding, soothing, and sleepless nights. Young parents often rely on support from partners and family members during this stage. But in situations where stress and conflict exist, the environment can quietly shift from nurturing to unstable. Over time, investigators would later discover that there were moments of tension inside the home. Text messages and conversations between the adults suggested growing frustration with the responsibilities of caring for a newborn. For many people, the constant demands of an infant can be overwhelming, but how someone responds to that stress can make all the difference. Healthy responses involve seeking help, asking family members for support, or stepping away briefly to calm down. Unhealthy responses can lead to resentment, and resentment toward a helpless child is one of the most dangerous warning signs in any household. On a spring day in March 2025, emergency services were called to the apartment. Responders arrived quickly and attempted to assist the infant before transporting her to a hospital. Despite the efforts of medical professionals, Ioni Souders did not survive. At first glance, the situation appeared to be a tragic medical emergency. But as doctors and investigators began asking questions, inconsistencies began to emerge. Those inconsistencies would soon transform the case from a medical investigation into a criminal one. When a young child dies unexpectedly, authorities must carefully determine what happened. This process is meticulous and often emotionally difficult. Investigators speak with everyone who had contact with the child. They review messages, timelines, and statements. They examine whether the explanations provided by caregivers align with the evidence. In this case, detectives began to notice contradictions. Statements about the child's condition did not fully match the timeline being described. Additionally, investigators reviewed text messages exchanged between Jose Melendez Padilla and Layla Souders. Some of those messages revealed frustration about the presence of the baby in the home. For investigators, communication like this can offer insight into emotional dynamics within a household. It does not prove a crime on its own, but it can reveal attitudes and tensions that may help explain behavior. Authorities eventually concluded that the circumstances surrounding the child's death required criminal charges. According to investigators, evidence suggested the baby had been subjected to harm over a period of time rather than a single sudden incident. Police charged Jose Melendez Padilla with murder and child abuse. Ioni Souders was also charged with serious offenses, including allegations that she failed to protect her daughter and misled investigators during the early stages of the case. The charges reflected the belief that protecting a child is a shared responsibility and that failing to intervene can have devastating consequences. 5. Psychological and behavioral analysis. Cases involving harm to children are often deeply disturbing, but they also raise important psychological questions. How does someone reach a point where they direct anger toward a child? Psychologists who study family violence often identify several risk factors. Stress and emotional immaturity. Young adults sometimes struggle with the sudden transition into parenthood. The loss of personal freedom, financial strain, and lack of sleep can create emotional pressure. Most parents cope with this stress in healthy ways, but individuals who lack emotional maturity may respond with frustration or resentment. Displacement of anger. Children, especially infants, cannot defend themselves. This makes them tragically vulnerable to displaced anger from adults who feel overwhelmed. When someone sees a child not as a responsibility but as an obstacle, their thinking can become dangerously distorted. The bystander dynamic. Another psychological element is the phenomenon known as the bystander effect. In some situations, individuals who witness harmful behavior may hesitate to intervene. They may hope the situation will improve, they may fear confrontation, or they may convince themselves that the situation is not as serious as it appears. In cases involving children, this hesitation can have irreversible consequences. Protecting a child sometimes requires difficult decisions, leaving a relationship, contacting authorities, or asking for outside help. Those choices can be uncomfortable, but they can also save lives. 6. Cultural and legal impact. Cases like this often trigger broader conversations about child protection. Communities begin asking difficult questions. How can warning signs be recognized earlier? What support systems are available for young parents? And how can authorities intervene before tragedy occurs? Child welfare organizations emphasize that prevention is possible. Education programs teach parents coping strategies for stress. Hotlines and community services provide assistance to families who feel overwhelmed. There is also increasing awareness about the importance of reporting concerns. Neighbors, relatives, and community members sometimes notice troubling behavior but hesitate to speak up. Yet many child protection advocates emphasize that raising concerns can be the first step in preventing harm. Legally, cases involving the death of a child often lead prosecutors to pursue the most serious charges available. The justice system aims not only to determine accountability, but also to send a broader message about society's duty to protect its most vulnerable members. The life of Ioni Souders lasted only a few months, but the questions surrounding her story will remain far longer. Cases like this remind us that children depend entirely on the adults around them. They cannot speak for themselves. They cannot escape dangerous situations. Their safety rests in the decisions of others. Sometimes, tragedies occur because someone chose anger over patience. Other times, they happen because someone stayed silent when they should have spoken. But every case carries a lesson. Pay attention to warning signs. Take concerns seriously. And remember that protecting children is not only a family responsibility, it is a community responsibility. Because behind every statistic is a child whose life could have been filled with birthdays, first steps, and a future yet to unfold. A future that deserved the chance to exist. If thoughtful discussions about real cases like this matter to you, And if you believe understanding these stories can help prevent future tragedies, consider subscribing to the channel. Here, we explore true crime not for shock or spectacle, but to learn, reflect, and remember the lives that should never be forgotten. And remember that protecting children is not only a family responsibility, it is a community responsibility. Because behind every statistic is a child whose life could have been filled with birthdays, first steps, and a future yet to unfold. A future that deserved the chance to exist. If thoughtful discussions about real cases like this matter to you, and if you believe understanding these stories can help prevent future tragedies, consider subscribing to the channel. Here, we explore true crime not for shock or spectacle, but to learn, reflect, and remember the lives that should never be forgotten.